Okay, and we're back. Hello, everyone. I'm here with our next speaker, and I'm having a bit of a fangirl moment because this is Daniel from Wikitongues. And if you paid attention, a lot of the ticket sales, like if you did buy a ticket for an amount of money, all of the proceeds will be donated to Wikitongues because we think it's a great initiative to support. So Daniel is a TED resident and the co-founder of Wikitongues, which grew out of a personal project he began in 2013. He has been working with online initiatives since 2011 and is a historian and designer by training, having studied at Parsons School of Design and the New School for Social Research in New York City. Wikitongues helps people get started with language documentation and revitalization. And in this talk, Daniel will take us on a journey across 5 countries to explore how people in vastly different social contexts are kickstarting mother tongue projects in their communities and finding ways to keep their languages alive. So I'll leave it to you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Antonia. As Antonia said, my name is Daniel Beaugrudel. I'm the co-founder and director of Wikitongues. Everyone has a right to know where they come from and to be who they are. And so we're working to ensure everyone has access to the language of their ancestors and the resources to keep it alive. Now, languages don't just die naturally. People abandon mother tongues because they're forced to. Often, the pressure is political. In 1892, the US Army General Richard Henry Pratt argued was the only alternative to killing indigenous people. Kill the Indian, he said, but save the man. And for decades, the government did just that, removing indigenous children from their families and forcing them into boarding schools where they were given English names and punished for speaking their languages. In 1931, Turkish President Mustafa Kemal Ataturk told an audience in the culturally diverse city of Adana that those who clung to minority languages like Kurdish, Armenian, or Ladino could not be trusted as Turks. In 1972, French President Georges Pompidou declared that there could be no place for minority languages in a France destined to make its mark on Europe. On every continent and in vastly different social contexts, assimilation has been a complement to genocide. 7,000 languages are alive today, but few are recognized by their own governments or supported online. So for people from the vast majority of cultures, globalization remains profoundly alienating. It means giving up your language for someone else's. And if nothing changes, as many as 3,000 languages could disappear in 80 years. Nearly half of all cultures are on the precipice of collapse, poised to take with them irreplaceable knowledge about human history and the natural world. But things are changing. Around the world, people are reviving ancestral languages and rebuilding their cultures. As far as we know, language revitalization began in the 1800s when, at a time of rising anti-Semitism, Jewish communities looked to their ancestral language, Hebrew, as a means of cultural survival. And though it had been dormant for over 1,000 years, it was well preserved in books of Jewish religion and philosophy. So Jewish activists studied and taught the language to their children, raising up the first native speakers in nearly 100 generations. Today, it's the mother tongue of 5 million Jewish people, and at least for me, an assimilated English-speaking member of the Jewish diaspora, a pillar of cultural sovereignty, a reminder of who I am and where I come from. 2,000 years later, we're still here. Now, until recently, Hebrew's reawakening was an anomaly. Few languages are as well preserved as ours was, and the creation of a Jewish state in part of Israel and Palestine created a space for Hebrew's daily use. In other words, most cultures just weren't given a chance. So I'm going to try and share my screen now. I've got a video for you that I hope works. Can you see my my slide? Well, you know what? Thankfully, this media is only illustrative. It's not essential to this story that I'm telling. So what I'm going to do is leave some videos, languages in the event chat during the Q&A so people can listen to them as forward. So as I was saying, Hebrew's reawakening was an anomaly for most of the past 200 years. And that's because many cultures weren't given a chance. So Cornish is the ancestral Cornwall, which today is technically a county in England. By the 19th century, English-only policies had driven Cornish into extinction. But in the 1900s, Cornish activists fought for their culture. Though language had been dormant for over 100 years, they used old books and plays to teach it to their children, reintroducing a language that had been stolen from their families. However, this new generation of Cornish speakers was scattered across Cornwall and unable to use the language freely. By the 1990s, Cornish had reawakened, but it wasn't thriving. Then, Cornish speakers found one another online and leveraged digital spaces to speak on a daily basis. From there, they organized weekly or monthly events where they could gather and speak in public. Today, some schools teach Cornish. There are Cornish language signs, ice cream commercials that I strongly encourage you to Google, Wikipedia, and even memes. And with their language once again intact, the people of Cornwall have secured recognition as a Celtic nation alongside Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. They stared down centuries of forced assimilation and said, "We're not a county in England. We're a people in our own right, and we're still here." And they're not the only ones. The Tunica Biloxi tribe of Louisiana is reviving their ancestral language. It started in the 1980s when Donna Pierre and her family started taking trips to Baton Rouge and New Orleans to photocopy old dictionaries stored away in university archives. The goal was to study Tunica and teach it to their children. Today, her family is leading a Tunica renaissance. Since 2014, there are nearly 100 speakers in language immersion classes. That's 10% of the tribe. And according to a 2017 census, 32 new fluent speakers, some of whom, like Donna's daughter Elizabeth, are teaching Tunica to their children. These new speakers are creating content, Facebook videos, and also memes. And the more they publish, the more they inspire other Tunica people to get involved. Like when a tribal member wrote Lisbeth on Facebook. This tribal member was living abroad in Texas off the tribal territory, asking how to say "bless these lands." It was for a yard sign so she could show her neighbors that her culture is alive and thriving today. Now, Hebrew, Cornish, and Tunica are just 3 examples from a groundswell of language activism on every continent. The Haida language, for example, after centuries of persecution by Canada, is growing again, with over 400 new speakers and a rich culture of mother tongue filmmaking, from animated shorts to feature-length movies. A consortium of open source activists from Ghana recently digitized 4,000 words in their mother tongue, Dagbani. The Kulili people of Australia just developed the first ever online dictionary for their ancestral language. Around the world, there's hope. There's also more support than ever for language revitalization. The internet is growing, expanding media access and creation, making it increasingly possible to share and teach your mother tongue across vast geography. One by one, governments are rolling back forced assimilation policies and, in some cases, investing in language. In the United States, for example, recent legislation included $20 million in funding for indigenous language projects. In Ghana, public schools now teach the country's native languages. Across Europe, the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages provides at least nominal and sometimes substantive support for the country's robust cultural diversity. And if your government won't help you, certain organizations might. The Script Encoding Initiative, Endangered Alphabets, 7,000 Languages, the Endangered Languages Project, Rising Voices, the Living Tongues Institute for Endangered Languages, and my own nonprofit, Wikitongues, can help you document your language, archive your language, or promote your language in your community. The First Peoples Cultural Council and the Endangered Languages Fund may even give you a grant. It's an exciting time to be a language activist, and yet, even with this tectonic expansion of support, keeping your language alive remains a profoundly challenging task. For a successful revitalization project to take hold, a lot needs to coincide. You need political freedom to express your culture. You need media access and the economic means to dedicate your time. You also need the skills to document your language, teach your language, and organize your community to sustain it. There's no greater obstacle than not knowing where to start. And there isn't a flexible, scalable answer to the increasingly common question, how do I save my language? At Wikitongues, we're building frameworks for people to answer that question themselves. Last year, with the Living Tongues Institute for Endangered Languages, we published the Language Sustainability Toolkit, which walks readers through the process of keeping your language alive, evaluating what your language needs, documenting it, promoting its use through community organizing. This year, we're testing these ideas with a cohort of language activists on the cusp of launching projects in their communities. There's Wendy Goodlow of the Black Seminole community in Texas and Coahuila, Sonia Rock of the Gitxsan Nation, Kamara of the Nalu culture in Guinea, Hangi Bulebe of the Hunde people in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Kamran Ali of the Wahi people, whose homeland sits at the intersection of Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, and China. Each activist's language is at a different level of risk and for different reasons, so each one is pursuing a different strategy. Wendy's language, Afro-Seminole Creole, has just a few fluent speakers today. It is underdocumented with one grammar sketch, one 1,000-word dictionary, and no known audio recordings. So Wendy's initial goal is as simple as it is ambitious. Learn the language herself and, in 1 year's time, inspire 20 people in her community to learn the language with her.
Okay, seems like we've lost Daniel. I'm not sure what happened to him. We'll see if we can get him back. Could you, in the chat, please, if you have any questions that I can pass on to Daniel when he comes back, that would be great. I'm not sure if there's any sign of him. Daniel? Question for the chat, if anyone's still watching. Have you tried to learn a heritage language? So maybe not necessarily an endangered language, but perhaps a language that your grandparents spoke, that maybe your parents didn't speak to you, and you reconnected to your culture from a language perspective. Maybe you can share some thoughts and some experiences in the chat. My grandparents are originally from Wales, so I started learning Welsh to reconnect to that Welsh that Welsh heritage of mine, although not many can speak Welsh in my family. But yes, while learning Welsh, I've noticed that I feel a bit lonely. I haven't really had any chance to speak to any people personally. And I think maybe a platform that has something like Chatterbug's live lessons, where you can connect to a tutor and then actually practice speaking with someone, would be a great help. Because also not everyone has like ancestors or family members or friends or communities where you can actually speak the language with other people. So let's see in the chat what we have here. Steffi wanted to start learning Quechua. I think that's a very popular one that I've come across a few times. Michelle reconnected with Persian. Her father comes from Iran, but had never taught it to herself or her brother. That's lovely. Astrid had the chance to speak some Italian and German to her parents. That was wonderful. And people asking me to speak some Welsh. I can't speak Welsh, that's the problem. I just know that very good is da iawn, and thank you is diolch. That's what I've learned so far. Bore da, good morning. Oh, it looks like Daniel's back. I no longer have to teach you any Welsh. Let's see if this works, if he comes back. But on Wikitongues, I did find a video where I could actually hear someone speaking fluent Welsh, which blew my mind. It was great. Because Wikitongues has an amazing YouTube channel where you can actually listen to people speak either revived languages or languages that are, you know, in need of revitalization. It's like a wonderful deep dive where you can find all of these beautiful languages from across the globe. Let's see what else we have here. We have some Georgian as well, reconnecting with Georgian. And that's lovely. I love how many languages are in the chat. Daniel, are you back? Let's see. Daniel, hi, welcome back.
Hi. When did I get
we
cut
thought
off?
you'd lost you. That's
When
so
did
strange.
So I didn't actually see that I had been cut out. I was like just giving the talk.
We've been talking this whole time.
This is so okay. So what was the last? So thank you for holding down the fort. What was the last thing to go? So what was the last thing?
I can't quite remember, but because I panicked and I started talking about me learning Welsh. So I'm not sure where you ended up.
Okay. Does anyone in the
but it's been about 4 minutes, so
where?
maybe the chat remembers better than I do because I'm in the sort of strange headspace.
Broadly, what was I talking about?
Everyone's talking about their heritage languages now. I started a conversation that's
excellent. We don't need to talk.
We have a really lovely array of languages here that people are like using to reconnect to their heritage, like to their grandparents, parents, and so on. So it's really lovely. So I think you can just start wherever you'd like to start again.
Okay. Well, so I was talking a little bit. Okay, great. So I had just been talking about Wendy's ambitious goal of doubling the speakers of her language in 1 year's time. I'm really sorry. I don't know what's going on with the technical difficulties today. I actually am seeing 2 of myself right now in this chat. So thanks everyone for your patience, but I'm thrilled to hear that everyone is engaging with ancestral and heritage languages. Anyway, can you all still see me? Excellent. Okay, so Wendy wants to double the Afro-Seminole Creole-speaking population and fast. Kamran, on the other hand, is in a different position. The Wahi language is spoken by as many as 60,000 people of all ages, but younger generations are beginning to abandon their mother tongue to the social pressures of assimilation. To change attitudes, Kamran wants to make Wahi more accessible. And unlike Afro-Seminole Creole, there's a wealth of material for learning Wahi, but most of it is in Russian due to the fact that it was created by the Soviets. And Russian is a language that most Wahis don't speak. Luckily, however, Kamran does speak Russian, and he lives in Moscow. So until international travel is safe again, he'll be translating and digitizing these resources for his friends back home. Sonia, Bintu, and Hangi are all working in support of early childhood education. Sonia is currently digitizing nursery rhymes in her language, Kitsanimach. Bintu is working to publish and distribute Nalu language books to 140 primary students by the end of 2023. Hangi, who already teaches the Kihunde language to small groups of Hunde children and adults, has plans to expand by standardizing educational materials and training a cohort of teachers. So where does Wikitongues fit in? Wendy, Kamran, Sonia, Bintu, and Hangi come from vastly different circumstances. Their languages are at different levels of risk, and their resources to launch language revitalization projects are different. However, the vision is the same: cultivate resilient community and sustain ancestral knowledge for the next generation. In practice, every community is different, and language revitalization means different things for different people. Sometimes we provide technical support like video editing and content archiving. Sometimes we act as connectors, introducing activists to linguists who can help them. In every case, we serve as a springboard for ideas, helping people hone their projects for measurable success. We help answer the question, how do I save my language? Nobody wants to see their language die, but people need help. And while help is on the way, for some, it isn't coming fast enough or at a large enough scale to keep up with the pace of language extinction. 3,000 languages, nearly half of every culture, could disappear in 80 years, but there are only a few hundred documented cases of stable, sustainable language revitalization. Today, we've talked about 5. Our social infrastructure isn't sufficient for this crisis. In an ideal world, there would be funding available for everyone who wants to keep their language alive. Everyone would also have the right to learn their own language. Time is running out to realize this equity, but you can help by fighting for just language policies, speaking out against linguistic discrimination, donating to projects that support linguistic diversity if you can, and by normalizing a multilingual world. So, what are your ancestral languages? I know that this was already being discussed when I disappeared for a second. Mine are Hebrew, Yiddish, Hungarian, and Scottish Gaelic, even though I was raised in English. And luckily for me, each of these languages is available online. Hebrew in particular, it came installed on my iPhone, it's supported by Google Translate, it even has autocorrect. And recently, Yiddish just got a Duolingo course. Your language may not be as widely supported, but I encourage you to investigate because chances are someone somewhere is fighting to keep it alive. Reclaiming your language and embracing your culture is a powerful way to be yourself in the age of globalization. Because as I first learned to say in Hebrew, anachnu adayin kan, we're still here. Thank you. I've been Daniel from Wikitongues, and I hope I still have time to take questions and chat with people.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. I'm sorry I spoiled that question. I didn't know that was.
It's okay. I'm glad that everyone was talking about that already. That's fantastic.
Yeah, so yeah, I thought that might be fitting. So we've had like quite a lot of in the chat, lots of people sharing which languages, like heritage languages, they've been connecting with. So Ukrainian, French, Swedish. As you said, Yiddish is now on Duolingo, which I think I also saw recently. I've been learning Welsh on Duolingo, which is my heritage language.
Extraordinary.
Even though none of my grandparents or family members that I know of can actually speak Welsh. So maybe now that I'm learning Welsh, I know more than my ancestors. But
that's all it takes to reintroduce a language.
It needs to be reintroduced. Absolutely, yes. One question I have, which kind of ties in with the whole system of language revitalization. So it's not just like you need technology to be able to document everything, and you need school books or even online courses available. Could you perhaps emphasize like what role does community play in language revitalization?
Yeah, I would say that community is the point, and community is also the medium, right? So when we talk about technology, language documentation, educational resources, these are all tools for language revitalization, but they're not language revitalization in of themselves, right? So there are a bunch of different reasons why communities stop speaking their language. Sometimes there's actual violent forced assimilation. And sometimes there are more subtle social pressures where the government doesn't support the language, doesn't teach it in schools, and kind of over time convinces a generation that their language no longer has value. And that generation stops speaking it, and then the language is dormant. But not dead, because as long as there's the cultural identity is still alive, the language can always be woken back up. So community the community organizing aspect of language revitalization is the whole social process of either bringing it back to life or revitalizing it to a state of vibrance, and also the kind of long-term process of keeping a language alive. Because a language, like revitalization, is a never-ending process, right? And so that can mean creating media and content that gets people excited about their language. It could mean holding in-person events. It could mean all sorts of things. It really depends on the community. But at the end of the day, it is about fighting the internal stigma that leads to assimilation. It's making your community proud of who they are. And cultivating space where they can speak the language freely without the pressures of the whatever the dominant language is.
Yeah, I remember learning about some indigenous languages in Australia where one of the efforts was to perhaps include the indigenous languages more in like ceremonies and festivities, so that even if people can't speak it amongst each other, they can at least learn songs and ceremonial language, so that at least it like releases this sort of feeling of pride within these people.
Absolutely.
As you said, like there are countries, especially countries that were rudely taken over by by English speaking people. That's a whole history that we don't need to talk about. But perhaps tying into that is how big is the impact on people who learn their heritage languages or like help revive and then let people of these nations learn their language and reconnect? Do you have any stats or personal anecdotes?
Yeah. So the first thing is that on a very immediate level, language revitalization can be an antidote to collective trauma or a way to work through collective trauma. There are a lot of studies in especially indigenous communities in North America and Australia that show mental health improves when a community has access to their ancestral language, and especially when they have lively revitalization efforts, right? So depression decreases, substance abuse decreases. It's often the case that children also actually do better in schools. And a lot of this has to do with the confidence, I think, of knowing who you are, where you come from, having access to the voice of your ancestors is a really, really important thing. When a language revitalization is really successful, there's also positive economic impact. I haven't seen like an economic study on this, so this is more my my own hot take. But you know, if you look at, let's say, Catalonia in Spain, which is a very successful case of language revitalization, there's a booming Catalan language media industry. There are a lot of newspapers that existed before the revitalization and only published in Spanish, now published in Spanish and Catalan. There's TV, there's movies, there's music. They're one of the more widely used languages online, despite only being spoken by 7 to 9 million people, right? So these are all economic opportunities, jobs that wouldn't have existed if Catalan hadn't been revitalized, right? So beyond the like just human aspect of people feeling good about themselves, having access to their culture, having better mental health, I think over time a language revitalization can also do wonders for the economy. Lastly, languages contain knowledge about the natural world. Only about 200 concepts exist in every language. So the vocabulary of almost every language is unique, right? And so for communities that live in traditionally less urban areas, right? Like 80% of the world's biodiverse regions are traditionally indigenous territories. Those indigenous languages contain knowledge of the natural world. So if that's your culture, it also means your relationship to your homeland, right, improves. And for the rest of humanity, your ability to conserve that homeland and sustain the ecosystem of that homeland improves. So the rest of humanity benefits too, right? Languages also contain clues about prehistory, before things were written, right? Like there's evidence of the Bering Strait migration, the Bantu migration, these kind of big events from tens of thousands of years ago, based on how languages are related to one another across geographies. So there's so many positive impacts of language revitalization and strong linguistic diversity on all levels of the human experience.
Absolutely fascinating. I love how language revitalization touches so many facets of life. Like it's really not just, I think in some aspects people think like, oh, if a language has died, so to speak, or is dormant, it's like, oh, why bother? Because no one speaks it. It's like, no, but we need to make people speak it so that it can positively influence all of our lives.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think we can squeeze in one more question because I love this.
Thank you.
Well, because a few have come in now from the chat, and let's see. One is, are you thinking about developing an app for Wikitongues?
We actually tried that in 2016. We demoed an app for building your own dictionary, and it didn't really go anywhere. So at the moment, we're working on merging some of the relevant features into another app that our partner organization, the Living Tongues Institute, maintains. It's called Living Dictionaries. And it is what it sounds like. It's a place where you can hop on and create multimedia dictionaries in your language. What we are doing is expanding the archive at wikitongues.org. Right now, it's a very minimum viable product, but we have a wealth of like oral histories from like over 700 languages, and we want to make that content more discoverable and more easily accessible. We're also working on a web crawling project to try and index all the languages on the internet that have some kind of free materials out there. So these are some of the software things that we're working on.
That's amazing. That sounds like a big job.
Yeah. We've got some great tech volunteers. We're a very small nonprofit. We only have 2 employees, but we have a lot of wonderful volunteers who dedicate their time, and we appreciate them very much.
Yeah, it takes a village, doesn't it?
Yes.
Okay, well, I think we've gone over time quite a bit, and I don't want to take up too much of the break that we are going to go on now. But during this break, there will be another little language lesson. You can find it in the sessions tab. I don't know which side it is. But thank you so much, Daniel, for your time, and also for coming back from that technical glitch was great.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I think I'm cursed. I think I'm cursed. All of the talks I've introduced have just had issues. Okay, but thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you everyone in the chat for bearing with us and for taking part with such great questions and sharing your stories. And yes, thank you, and have a lovely little break, and I will see you all later. Thank you.
And I'm going to share some of these languages in the group chat now so you can listen to them.
Yes, please. Yeah, in the chat, I think many will be so happy to connect with you. That'd be great.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.